Welcome back everyone, History with Hilbert here, and I'm joining you again today with another History Visualized, and this time we're going to be having a look at the Great Heathen Army, or the coming of the Danes. Now in the previous video about Viking raids in Britain, I made several points about the earliest Viking attacks in Britain, and these were hit and run attacks. So like the attack on the monastery at Lindisfarne, the people we now call the Vikings, they would have come in, they would have smashed and pillaged an area, and then they would have got out before anything could happen, before an enemy army could have got them. But with the Great Heathen Army, we see that this is different, because with the Great Heathen Army, as you can probably tell from the name, it is an actual army. And this army first landed in East Anglia, and instead of just attacking East Anglia, they actually managed to get horses in East Anglia, and they then went to York, and they captured York. And if you are familiar with the Last Kingdom, this is actually the battle in which Uhtred's father is killed, which is the Battle of Ethelwich. And Ethelwich, which I covered in a previous video, was the Old English name for the city of York. And this army, this Great Heathen Army, is, the tradition says that it was led by the three sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. And if you're interested about the name Ragnar Lothbrok, I actually have a little video where I go into some detail about it, called How Viking Names Work. And in that video as well, I say that we're not actually sure if Ragnar Lothbrok was an actual character, if he actually existed. And in actual fact, I think that Ragnar Lothbrok is more someone who's been collated from several people who have been turned into one person, all of these exploits. And the tradition has it that Ragnar Lothbrok made sort of a Yule oath, and the Yule oath was essentially where the Scandinavians would boast something at Yule, and they would swear to the gods that they would do it, or they would die trying. And Ragnar's boast was that he would capture the entire kingdom of Northumbria with 2 shipfuls of men. So true to his oath, and probably with a very bad hangover the morning after, he sets out to capture Northumbria. But obviously he fails because, well, they would have to be ships of very, very good men to capture Northumbria. And he's put to death in the snake pit by King Aela. And he says, while he is dying, he cries out and he says, you know, oh, how the little piggies would grunt if they could hear how the old boar suffered. And true to his words, his 3 sons, Ivar the Boneless, who, fun fact, actually probably wasn't that disabled, it's probably a mistranslation of the Old Norse Beinlausti, which probably meant more restless because he was constantly jumping from country to country to attack and pillage different places, but that's the topic for another video. Harald, who is called often with the Wide Embrace, and also Ubba. And Ubba is a very interesting one because Ubba is called Ubba the Frisian. So of course I'm going to be interested in this, and actually it's possible that some of the Great Heathen Army might actually have been Frisian, because Ubba was one of the big leaders, and he was often called Dux Frisonum in Latin, even though I said that with a French accent for some reason, because he was called the Duke of the Frisians because he was a Danish warlord who had a power base in Frisia. So it seems like a good idea to my mind that he probably would have recruited from there as well. But anyway, these 3 are the given names for some of the leaders of the Great Heathen Army. After they sacked York, the Great Heathen Army moved on to Nottingham, and at this time Nottingham was in the Kingdom of Mercia. And if you're interested in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and you haven't seen it already, then you should definitely check out episode 2 in the series, where I go into quite a lot of detail about the different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. As always, any videos I'm mentioning now will be linked in the description below, and they should even appear up on the screen and in the end screens as well. So they marched to Nottingham, and at Nottingham they're met by a large army of Mercians, but also of Wessexmen, because the Mercian king asked the men of Wessex to help him to repel this Danish invasion, and they both lay siege to the Great Heathen Army in Nottingham. But there isn't really a clear outcome, and both sides lose a lot of men, and the Saxons go home again. The Mercians, who are now on their own because the Wessexmen have left them, then pay off the Danes to leave. And we see this happen quite a lot because the Anglo-Saxons, especially early on, had no idea what to do against this huge Danish army, because the Danes were much better fighters in this early stage than the Anglo-Saxons, so they paid them off, and we see this happen again and again. And it happened so often that they even coined a specific term for it, which was Danegeld, which literally meant Dane money. So for example, geld you can still see in Dutch, it literally means geld, means money, so you can see the connection there. And then the Danes move on to East Anglia, and this time they won't be paid off by the king, and they actually end up killing King Edmund of East Anglia and taking it. And if you have seen or read The Last Kingdom, this is actually shown in the series, which is where they have the king and they shoot him full of arrows because he says, oh, look at this saint who was also shot full of arrows. And then Ubba says, well, if your God's so great, then he should save you now. And, we all know it didn't really go too well for Edmund, whether God exists or not. After taking East Anglia, the Great Heathen Army moves on to Wessex, and again they are paid to leave, this time by King Alfred, and when they leave they then go on to attack London. And London, remember, it technically belonged to the Kingdom of Mercia, even though it traditionally bordered on 4 or 5 of the older Anglo-Saxon kingdoms when Kent and Sussex were still independent from Wessex. And after this they return to Northumbria, and they spend the winter on the Tyne in a great camp. And the army actually splits at this point, and this leads me on to an interesting point about the Danes, because it's often been wondered why they went over to Europe and the rest of Europe. So, for example, England, Scotland, Ireland, Francia, Frisia. Why did they go over and raid so much? And one of the reasons that's often given is because there wasn't much farmland, and in the Germanic tradition, the eldest son took all, and the younger sons would then, they'd have to move on and find something else, and that's often given as a reason. And this sort of rings true if we look at the Great Heathen Army, because now, of course, they've captured York, and they've captured the area around York. So if you remember back to my second episode in this series, they've captured essentially the area of the old kingdom of Deira. And they've also captured East Anglia, and now there is lots of land. Now lots of the native, or dare I say native, Anglo-Saxon population have fled, so now there's lots of farmland which is open, and lots of the Danes, I think even the Anglo-Saxon chronicler says that the Danes, in Halfdan, that they put the land under the plough of Northumbria, so that essentially the Danes, they put down their weapons and they become farmers, and they start farming this area. But obviously there wasn't enough land to go around, so a large part of the army, although the other part is now happily farming in Northumbria, then moves on to Mercia, and they complete the conquest of Mercia. And at this point there is only one kingdom remaining, and that is the Kingdom of Wessex. So that is actually where the title for the last kingdom comes from, because Wessex was the last kingdom left that wasn't invaded by the Danes. Although this isn't entirely true, and I will get onto that in my next video. Now, they make several attempts to capture Wessex, and this is also, shown in The Last Kingdom. So, for example, with all the Danish attacks, and they come very close, actually. They did a surprise attack on Chippenham, which was, back then, one of the royal courts of King Alfred. And King Alfred actually had to flee, and he fled into hiding into the marshes of Somerset. And a fun fact is that I actually used to live in Somerset, so I have all sorts of connections with this story. And he was hiding in these marshes of Somerset, and this is where we also get the story about him burning the cakes and falling asleep. But they make a real comeback, the Anglo-Saxons and Alfred, and they then smash the Danes under Guthrum at the Battle of Edington. And I know I keep bringing it back up, but that is the last battle in the first season of The Last Kingdom. And that sort of brings us up to the point where we get essentially a stalemate between the Danes. Now, the Danes had a blitzkrieg, if you will, of the British Isles. They've captured some of the most important kingdoms. Mercia, if you remember from my second episode in this series, was one of the most powerful kingdoms, and they took Mercia without really much trouble at all. They took East Anglia, they've taken most of Northumbria, and they pinched quite a lot of what used to be Kent as well, and Wessex almost was on its knees. And if Wessex had fallen, I have no doubt that today England would be called Daneland instead, and we'd probably be speaking something that sounded a lot more like Danish than English. It would also be very interesting, actually, and I think it would be very fun to see what an England would look like that had been fully conquered by the Danes. Who knows? But that didn't happen, and that's why we're speaking English and why we still live in England, and you can thank Alfred the Great. And obviously this is a massively interesting topic, the Great Heathen Army and everything that comes with it, so I'm definitely going to make more videos, but this is going to be it for this one in the Anglo-Saxon history visualized. Alright everyone, thanks very much for watching. So again, this has been a video in my Anglo-Saxon History Visualised series, although this is the second one where the Danes have played a central role. And in the next episode, I'm going to look at King Alfred in the sort of latter part of his reign. So if you imagine this is the earlier part, where he keeps Wessex from falling into Danish hands, which is very important, but actually he goes on to go onto the offensive, and his son, Edward, also goes onto the offensive, as well as Athelflaed, who is a very interesting character called Lady of the Mercians. So make sure to tune in again next week for that episode of Anglo-Saxon History Visualised, and don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Alright everyone, thanks very much for watching. I'm History with Hilbert, and I'll hope you'll join me again soon.